Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into something that might seem simple at first. But trust me, there's a lot to unpack here. We're talking about God as refuge and fortress.
Refuge and Fortress.
Yeah, that idea of finding safety and strength in faith.
Right, and you sent over some really thought-provoking material for this.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Including, of course, that classic Psalm 91.1 to 2.
Always a good place to start.
So we're going to break down those powerful metaphors, see how these ideas pop up all over the Bible, and maybe even, hopefully, discover some new ways to think about what it means to find that sense of security in faith.
You know, it's funny, isn't it, how those metaphors, refuge and fortress, they speak to something really deep in us, like a basic human need for safety and security.
Yeah, totally. But it's more than just like needing a roof over our heads, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, any old building could do that. We're talking about something much deeper here.
Okay, so what makes these biblical terms so different? What sets them apart? Well, let's think about it historically for a second. Back then, a refuge wasn't just any shelter. It was a place you could escape to, completely out of reach of your enemies.
Like a true sanctuary.
Exactly. A place to find not just physical safety, but also a chance to, catch your breath and regroup.
To find that inner peace amidst the chaos.
And a fortress. Forget about it. We're not talking passive protection here. Think strong walls, high ground, built to withstand anything.
It's like that image of being completely surrounded, protected on all sides, impenetrable.
Right. And Psalm 91 brings those two ideas together, combining comfort and strength. God as both a source of peace and a powerful defender.
It's so powerful. And you mentioned Psalm 91.1 to 2,
Yeah.
which I think even people who aren't particularly religious might have heard at some point. Those words, "Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust." Something about that is just, I don't know, so comforting.
Sounds like a lullaby. It is. But there's also this underlying strength to it, right?
Oh, totally. It's not just about feeling safe. It's about the source of that safety and that we're dwelling. That
Mhm.
implies an active choice.
Not just, oh, I'll pop in when things get tough.
Exactly. It's about building your life around that connection with God.
It's like making God's presence your home base.
Yes, making Him your foundation. And that shadow metaphor is interesting too, isn't it?
It is. Because it's not just about being hidden, right?
Right. Think about being out in the desert, completely exposed, and then suddenly you find this patch of shade.
Relief.
That sense of respite, that's the kind of protection God offers, that relief from the scorching sun. But as you pointed out, there's also this firmness, this strength to it.
Like standing on those fortress walls, looking out and knowing that nothing can touch you.
And that brings us to that line, "My God, in whom I trust." Trust seems key here, not just belief.
Oh, 100%. You can believe in something without actually trusting it, Yeah, it's like knowing about a bridge, but not being sure if it'll hold your weight.
Right. It's about taking that step, putting your weight on it, trusting it to carry you.
So trusting God is about actively choosing to rely on His protection, to let it, surround you.
Yes, to surrender to it.
We've talked a lot about Psalm 91, but these ideas, this refuge and fortress imagery, it shows up in other parts of the Bible too, right?
Oh, definitely. Woven throughout. It's not just a one-off thing.
So where else do we see it?
Well, take Psalm 18.2, for instance. David, the warrior king. He describes God as, I love this, "my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold." I mean, come on.
He throws in every metaphor he can think of.
Doesn't he? It's like he's trying to capture every facet of God's protection.
From that solid foundation to that active defense, like you were saying before about that fortress on the hill.
It's amazing, right? And it makes you think. Different people facing different challenges.
Mhm.
They might seek different kinds of refuge.
Oh, for sure. Like what feels like a safe haven in one situation might not cut it in another.
Exactly. And that's something that comes up in other Psalms, too. Take Psalm 46, for
But
example.
what's special about that one?
It's all about those times of complete chaos and uncertainty. You know, when everything feels like it's falling apart. Verse 1 says, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble."
Okay, so already we're getting that sense of safety and support.
Right. And then, to drive the point home, verse 2 goes on, "Therefore we will not fear though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea."
Wow, talk about a bold statement. It's like, bring on the apocalypse. I'm not scared.
That's the kind of confidence we're talking about, rooted in that unshakable divine protection.
Because no matter what happens around us, that foundation remains solid.
Exactly. And you mentioned how that refuge idea, how it kind of adapts to different needs.
Yeah, like we were saying, what offers comfort and security in one situation might not be enough in another. So are there examples of that beyond just like needing emotional support?
Oh, absolutely. Proverbs 18:10 takes a slightly different angle. It says, "The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run to it and are safe." Here, it's not a physical place. It's God's name itself that offers that refuge.
It's like invoking that name, calling on his authority for protection.
Yes. Like a verbal fortress, you could say.
So interesting. Are there any other examples of this refuge idea showing up in surprising ways?
Isaiah 25:4 really stood out to me. It talks about God being a shelter from the storm and a shade from the heat for the weak, for the needy in his distress, a refuge from the storm, a shade from the heat when the blast of the terrible ones is like a storm against the wall.
Wow, a lot of imagery there. But the core message is clear. God cares for the vulnerable.
Exactly. Those who are often overlooked or taken advantage of, God is their shelter, their defender.
That's so powerful. It's like a mother bird protecting her chicks under her wings. It makes you realize that this refuge, it's not just about personal safety. It's about God's heart for those in need. But, while you were going through all those verses, I was thinking about some of the questions people often have about this whole God as refuge concept. Because it's not always easy to reconcile those beautiful metaphors with, the realities of life.
That's true.
Like, if God is truly a fortress, why do bad things happen? What does it actually look like to dwell in his shelter? Those are some big questions.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I'm guessing our listeners have some thoughts on those too.
Definitely. But I think we'll save those for next time. We've got a lot to unpack there.
You're right. Those questions you brought up, they're really at the heart of it all.
Yeah.
They get to like the core of what it means to believe in a God who protects, but also to live in a world where, well, bad things happen. It's a tough one.
Yeah. It's a tension a lot of people feel. We hear about this refuge, this fortress, and then, bam, life throws a curveball. And it's like, wait, where was that protection?
Right. So how do we make sense of that? How do we reconcile those two things?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Well, I think maybe a good place to start is by really digging into what dwelling in the shelter of the Most High actually means. Because, yeah, sometimes it does feel like we're supposed to just hide away and wait for the storm to pass.
Like hunker down and hope for the best.
Yeah, but I don't think that's the whole picture.
Okay, so it's more than just running for cover when things get rough. So what is it then?
Well, think about what it means to actually dwell somewhere, to make it your home, your center. It's about building your whole life around that presence, that connection.
So dwelling in the shelter of the Most High is about making God the foundation of everything, not just a backup plan.
Exactly. He's not plan B. He's the whole blueprint.
I like that. Okay, so it's about that constant connection. But then there's the question of, can God really protect us from everything? If we're truly dwelling in his shelter, shouldn't we be, I don't know, immune to bad things?
That's where things get, I think, a little more nuanced. Because while the Bible definitely talks about God's protection, it doesn't exactly promise a life free from hardship. We still live in a world where bad things happen, a world that can be pretty chaotic and, yeah, unpredictable at times.
So even if we have this deep relationship with God, we're not exempt from suffering.
Right. Life's still going to throw those curveballs.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. God's protection, it might show up in ways we don't expect. Sometimes it's not about preventing the storm.
But more about being there with us in the middle of it.
Exactly. Like, think of a ship in a storm.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The anchor doesn't stop the waves from crashing, right?
Yeah.
But it keeps the ship from being totally swept away.
It provides that stability.
Right. God's protection can be that anchor, providing that stability, that hope when everything else feels like it's, falling apart.
That's a really helpful way to think about it. So if we find ourselves in trouble, feeling afraid, what does it look like to actively seek that refuge in God, to actually run to that fortress?
Well, Psalm 91 talks about calling on his name, remembering his promises. It's about turning to him in prayer.
Pouring out our hearts to him.
Exactly. Sharing our anxieties, our fears, reminding ourselves of his faithfulness. It's about, making that conscious choice to shift our focus from the problem to the one who is bigger than the problem.
Okay, so instead of getting lost in our fear, we redirect our attention to the source of our strength.
You got it. It's like choosing to look at that anchor instead of the waves. It doesn't magically make the storm disappear, but it reminds us that we're not alone, that we have something solid to hold on to.
It's about finding that grounding amidst the chaos. But let's be real, there are times when people face just unimaginable suffering. Even when they have faith, how do we reconcile that with this idea of God as protector?
That is a question, right? One that people have been wrestling with for, I don't know, centuries. And honestly, there are no easy answers. But I do think it's important to remember that God's protection, it doesn't always look the way we expect it to.
So it might not be about preventing bad things from happening, but more about being present with us in those moments.
Yes. Sometimes it's about giving us the strength to endure, the grace to forgive, the hope to keep going when everything feels hopeless.
So it's not about God failing to protect us. It's about his presence taking on different forms in those difficult moments. It's about adapting to the situation.
Exactly. It might be the comfort of a friend, the support of a community, or even just that inner sense of peace, that surpasses all understanding. It's about trusting that even in those dark moments, the darkest times, God is still there.
Even when we can't see how or why, it's about faith. Which brings us back to trust, doesn't it? We talked about it earlier, but it seems even more crucial when we're talking about God's protection in the face of suffering.
Couldn't agree more. Because when we truly trust God, we can rest in knowing that He's working all things together for our good, even when we don't understand what He's doing or why. It's about having that faith that His plan is bigger than our pain.
That his love is stronger than our fear.
Exactly. And that's a powerful place to be.
It is. This has been such an insightful conversation, but I'm wondering, how do we move beyond the theoretical and actually experience this protection in our daily lives? Like, how do we make those metaphors of refuge and fortress a reality?
That's the question, right? It's all well and good to talk about these things, but how do we live them out? How do we build our lives around that connection with God, that sense of being held and protected?
So it's about taking those ancient concepts and finding ways to apply them to our modern world, like bridging the gap between the theoretical and the practical.
Exactly. And I think there's some pretty tangible steps we can take to do that.
Oh, I like the sound of that. I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear about some, actionable ways to connect with this idea of God as their refuge.
Well, I think first and foremost, it's about cultivating a consistent practice of prayer. And I'm not just talking about, when we're in crisis mode, but as a regular part of our daily lives. It's about making that connection with God a habit, a rhythm that sustains us.
So it's less about, asking for things and more about just nurturing that relationship, staying in communication.
Yeah, it's about opening our hearts to God, sharing our joys, our burdens, seeking His guidance, and sometimes just basking in His presence. There's something really grounding about knowing that we can always turn to Him, no matter what we're going through.
It's like having that direct line to the fortress, knowing help is always available. What else can we do to make this idea of refuge more tangible? How do we actually build that fortress in our lives?
Another powerful practice is immersing ourselves in Scripture. It's in the Bible that we encounter God's character, His promises, His faithfulness throughout history. It's where we find stories of people who faced incredible challenges, yet found strength and hope in their relationship with God.
It's about letting those stories and teachings speak to us, shape us, not just reading words on a page, but actually encountering the living God through them.
Exactly. It's about letting those words speak to our hearts, shape our minds, and guide our steps. And something I found helpful is to really focus on passages that talk about God as refuge and fortress.
It's like you're building a mental map of that safe haven so you know exactly where to go when you need it.
Exactly. You're creating those pathways in your mind, those connections. But, sometimes faith can feel like a pretty solitary journey.
It can, especially when you're in the middle of a storm. It's easy to feel alone.
Right. But we're not meant to do this alone. Finding a community of believers, people who can support us, encourage us, and point us back to God when we're struggling, that's crucial.
So it's like finding our own little fortress within the larger body of Christ, a place where we can be vulnerable and supported.
I love that. It's about having people who can pray for us, offer wisdom, and walk alongside us through those ups and downs. It's a tangible expression of God's love and care for us.
It makes you realize that this refuge, it's not just a solitary shelter, it's a network of support, a community of strength. But before we move on, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about how God's protection might show up in unexpected ways. Can you expand on that a bit? Because sometimes it feels like if something bad happens, it means God's protection has failed.
Yeah, I get that. It's easy to fall into that trap. But sometimes we get so focused on God protecting us from harm that we miss all the other ways He's working in our lives.
So it's not always about preventing bad things from happening, but more about equipping us to handle them.
Right. His protection might be giving us the wisdom to make a tough decision, the courage to speak up for what's right, or even the strength to forgive someone who's hurt us.
It's about recognizing that God's protection isn't just about physical safety. It's about guiding us toward wholeness and growth, even if that means going through some painful stuff along the way.
Exactly. Sometimes those difficult experiences, they're the ones that lead to the greatest growth. Like a muscle.
Yeah.
It needs to be challenged to get stronger.
Mm.
And God's protection might be about giving us the strength to go through those challenges and come out the other side more resilient, more whole.
Stronger and more complete. Man, this has been such a rich conversation. We've really dug deep into this whole God as refuge and fortress concept. But before we wrap up, there's one last question that I think we need to address. What about those times when it feels like God is distant? When we don't sense his presence or his protection, what do we do then? Because let's be honest, sometimes that fortress feels empty, like the refuge has been deserted.
Yeah, that's real. And it's something I think we all experience at some point in our faith journey. Those moments of doubt, of feeling alone.
Like we're calling out for help, but there's no answer. So how do we navigate those times?
Well, first, I think it's important to remember that our feelings don't always reflect reality. Just because we don't feel God's presence doesn't mean he's not there. It's like the sun, it's always shining, even when it's hidden behind the clouds.
So it's about trusting that God is still there, even when we can't see him or feel him.
Exactly. And, sometimes those seasons of doubt, those dry spells, those are the times when our faith is actually being stretched and strengthened the most. It's like a tree. Its roots grow deepest during times of drought.
So even when we feel like we're wandering in the wilderness, God is using those experiences to draw us closer to him.
He's right there with us, even in the wilderness.
That's reassuring. But what are some practical things we can do when we're feeling that distance from God? Like, how do we reconnect with that sense of refuge and fortress when it feels so far away?
Well, I think it starts with honesty. We need to be willing to acknowledge our doubts and struggles to God.
So just be real with him.
Yeah. He already knows what we're going through, but there's something powerful about actually bringing those feelings to him in prayer.
Like having that honest conversation, even if it feels messy or uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's about letting him know where we're at, what we're wrestling with, and asking for his help to navigate those tough emotions. Sometimes just the act of voicing those doubts can start to chip away at them. It's like letting some light into that fortress, allowing God's presence to illuminate those dark corners.
Yeah, it's about inviting him into those spaces. What else can we do to reconnect with that sense of refuge when we're feeling lost?
Sometimes it's helpful to go back to the basics. Spending time in prayer, meditating on Scripture, focusing on the things we know to be true about God, even when we don't feel them.
It's like grounding ourselves in those truths, even when our emotions are pulling us in different directions.
Exactly. It's like reminding ourselves of the layout of that fortress, even when we're feeling lost in the darkness. We know it's there. We just need to reorient ourselves.
This has been so helpful, and I know our listeners are going to appreciate those practical tips. But before we move on, I want to circle back to the core message of Psalm 91.1-2, like the one takeaway you want our listeners to really grasp.
It's about recognizing that our ultimate security is found not in our circumstances, not in our possessions, not even in our own efforts, but in the unwavering love and faithfulness of God.
So it's about shifting our focus from the things we can control to the one who holds it all together.
Exactly. It's about surrendering to that love, to that protection, and allowing it to permeate every aspect of our lives. That's where true freedom lies.
It's a powerful thought. But how do we move beyond just the idea of surrender and actually live it out in our day-to-day lives? What does that look like, practically speaking?
That's a great question. And I think it's something we'll continue to explore in the next part of our deep dive. Because surrender, it's a journey, not a destination. It's about learning to trust God more and more each day, letting go of our need to control everything, and just resting in knowing that He's always with us, guiding us, protecting us, even when we don't realize it.
It's funny. When we talk about God as a fortress, we usually think about strength, right? Like holding firm, being unbreakable. But surrender, it almost feels like the opposite of that.
That's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Like, how can letting go be the strongest defense?
Exactly. So are you saying that true strength actually comes from recognizing our own limitations, like admitting that we can't do it all on our own?
Yeah, I think so. It's about releasing that tight grip we have on our lives and allowing ourselves to be held by something bigger, something stronger, something more stable.
And that's what God offers us.
Exactly. A refuge that's not built on our own efforts, but on his unwavering love and faithfulness.
I mean, it sounds beautiful, but it's not easy, is it? Especially in a world that's all about self-reliance and independence. It's almost like we're told to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and never show weakness.
It definitely goes against the grain, doesn't it? But I think when we talk about refuge and fortress, we're not just talking about physical safety. We're talking about finding that place where we can truly be ourselves.
To let our guard down.
Exactly. Where we can rest in knowing that we're accepted and loved no matter what.
So it's about finding that sense of belonging, of being held and protected, not just from outside threats, but also from our own, inner critic, our own fears and insecurities.
That's it. And that's what surrender allows us to do. It's about letting go of that need to prove ourselves, to control everything, to be perfect,
It's like giving ourselves permission to be human, to be imperfect.
and to let God fill those spaces with his grace and love.
It makes me think about those times when we feel like we've really messed up. When we're carrying around all that shame and guilt. It's like we're trying to build our own fortress out of those negative emotions instead of letting ourselves find refuge in God's forgiveness.
Wow, that's a powerful image. And it's true, sometimes the hardest walls to break down are the ones we build around our own hearts.
So how do we break those walls down?
Well, that's where God's grace comes in. It's like a battering ram, it can shatter even the toughest defenses, allowing his love to flood in and wash away all that shame and guilt.
So surrender is not just about giving up control. It's about opening ourselves up to receive God's healing and restoration.
Absolutely. It's about letting him work in those deep places to mend the broken pieces and make us whole again. And that's where real transformation happens. When we surrender to God's love, we're not just finding refuge, we're being made new.
This has been such an inspiring conversation. We've really uncovered some profound truths about what it means to experience God as our refuge and fortress. But before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to our listeners. What's one practical step they can take today to start embracing this idea of surrender in their own lives?
That's a good question. I think a great place to start is with a simple prayer. Just take a moment to acknowledge your need for God's protection and guidance, and just ask him to help you let go of the things you're holding on to too tightly.
It doesn't have to be anything fancy.
Nope. Just a heartfelt expression of your desire to surrender to his will, to find rest in his presence.
That's beautiful. Just a simple prayer, opening our hearts to God's grace and letting him take the lead. I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I know our listeners are going to walk away feeling encouraged and empowered to embrace God as their refuge and fortress in new and meaningful ways. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found this exploration of God as refuge and fortress both challenging and comforting. Remember, no matter what you're facing, you are not alone. There's a God who loves you, who sees you, and who offers you a place of safety and strength. Until next time, keep seeking, keep growing, and keep diving deep.